Hello, everyone. Looks like we arrived at another stop on this train, and while this one isn't the roughest yet, it's definitely one that gets people arguing. If you made it this far, buckle up because this stop is about borders, truth, and what people actually see happening, not what they're told to see. So, if you made it this far, buckle up because this stop isn't going to be any easier, but it might be a little more honest. I said before, I've noticed that labeling for the left has basically replaced thinking. Instead of having real conversations, people just throw around words like racist, Islamophobe, and Nazi, and suddenly the discussion is over. The label does all the work. It's an easy way to shut people down without ever asking if what they said might actually have a point. I touched on this subject a little in my earlier videos, but I'm going to double down on it in this one because labeling isn't just lazy, it's become a way to control the conversation, and the more I noticed it, the harder it was to unsee. That's where I started realizing the left wasn't winning arguments anymore. They were just naming and shaming, and after a while the labels lost their power. When every disagreement gets called hate, these words stop meaning anything. People basically labeled anyone on the right as Nazis, and that was effective because during World War II, the Nazis caused so much devastation that the word itself was enough to shut down the conversation. It didn't matter whether or not Germans back then weren't the ones personally causing the damage, the association was enough. That's why people on the left leaned on it so hard. It was a very effective talking point. But the problem is, this isn't World War II, so just because some people on the right have extreme views, putting a Nazi label on the whole right isn't a sustainable way to win arguments. We're not living in conditions where that kind of label is enough on its own. And honestly, a lot of that labeling was unnecessary because when you look at the magnitude of false claims coming from parts of the Republican Party, like the so called big lie, the behavior already speaks for itself. They spent years insisting that the 2020 election was rigged or stolen, despite dozens of court cases affirming the results. What they said under oath was often very different from what they told the American public. The best verification I have is that I've seen no mass arrests for voter fraud. That alone is enough for me to believe the election wasn't stolen. If there really had been a coordinated plot that massive, there would have been consequences, but there weren't. But here's the problem. Even though I can admit that, I still don't trust the fact-checking system because when I tried to verify other claims, I started noticing patterns. Google, for example, at one point during my research, said that conservatives have spread false claims about border policy or immigration, claiming they've promoted the narrative of chaos. What makes that situation even weirder is that I went to do research a second time and then Google said the exact opposite. Google debunkers aside, when you actually look at the numbers, the record high illegal crossings, the lack of vetting, the overwhelmed facilities, there was chaos at the border. Those aren't just rumors, they're real, measurable outcomes. We now, for example, learned that nearly half of the children who came in unaccompanied wound up in very dangerous situations, including human trafficking, forced labor, and abuse. Thousands of calls to the service hotlines set up for them went unanswered. That doesn't sound like a system under control. That sounds like a crisis that was swept under the rug. I also can't trust the narrative out there claiming there was no chaos at the border because I remember when a lot of major outlets were saying exactly that. So, back in 2018 and 2019, the media's framing of the border looked very different. Major outlets like the Washington Post, Vox, and Forbes routinely dismissed the idea that there was a crisis at all. The Washington Post ran pieces with headlines like, "There's no immigration crisis," and these charts prove it. And 5 reasons Trump's immigration crisis is a made-up one. Forbes published articles claiming that government data showed no crisis at the border, arguing that the numbers simply didn't support Trump's narrative. Even Vox published think pieces questioning whether the word crisis was fair to use at all, suggesting instead that the situation was largely manufactured for political gain. At the time, these stories dominated the conversation. The idea that calling it a crisis was alarmist, partisan, and designed to provoke fear. However, a few years later, these exact same outlets started using the exact language they once mocked. Vox published a piece in 2024 called "America's Misunderstood Border Crisis" in 8 charts. openly describing what it had once called manufactured. The Washington Post ran stories comparing Biden and Trump on immigration, admitting that illegal crossings had hit record heights and that facilities were overwhelmed. Even Forbes, which used to argue there was no crisis, ran headlines like Solving America's Two Immigration Crisis, warning about chaos along the southern border and the strain it was putting on local communities. The facts didn't really change, only the framing did. What used to be called a manufactured crisis suddenly became a humanitarian crisis. That shift alone shows how much politics decides what gets called truth. So when I see that the same people who once said there was no crisis are now calling it a humanitarian crisis, it makes me realize the facts didn't change, the framing did, and that's why so many people don't trust the media anymore. They don't believe the spin, they believe what they see. So, even the supposed fact checkers start bending the truth to protect their narrative. It makes it really hard to trust anyone. That's when I realized this problem goes beyond politics. It's not just about left versus right anymore. It's about whether we, as regular people, can even access truth that isn't filtered through someone's agenda. Another narrative I don't trust is the one claiming that the economy performs better under left leaning policies. There are plenty of studies and reports out there that make this case. For example, both the Economic Policy Institute and the Joint Economic Committee of Congress have published findings showing that historically the U.S. economy grows faster under Democratic presidents. They cite higher GDP growth, faster job creation, and lower unemployment rates on average during Democratic administrations. But then you start looking at what's actually happening in blue states and major Democratic run cities, and the picture completely changes. Studies from UC Berkeley and other research groups show that, yes, on paper, blue states appear wealthier and the national economy may look stronger under Democrats, but those numbers are skewed by just a few metro areas like New York, San Francisco, and Seattle that produce a huge share of national output. When you dig deeper, a more complicated story emerges. Blue cities inside red states, places like Austin, Atlanta, and Nashville, and others perform well, benefiting from lower state taxes and looser regulations while maintaining urban innovation. Meanwhile, blue cities inside blue states tend to struggle. They struggle from high taxes, strict regulations, and inflated housing markets of other states. They make unaffordable for the middle class in those states. Even neutral think tanks have started calling the blue states affordability challenge, the idea that housing costs, regulations, and taxes are driving people away from places like California, New York, and Illinois towards red or purple states with lower costs and more affordability. So, when you set those narratives side by side, they completely contradict each other. On paper, the national economy may look stronger under Democrats, but on the ground, in many blue state cities, people are struggling with unaffordability, homelessness, and safety issues. And that's why when a conservative points out that blue state cities are falling apart, it sounds believable because that's exactly what people are seeing with their own eyes. It's what they're experiencing. They don't need a political spin to notice it. You start discounting all the so called professional or educational information out there because it just doesn't match your lived experience. And that's exactly why conservatives are winning the narrative. It's not because they're necessarily right about everything, but because people's day to day reality lines up with what they're saying. So maybe that's the real lesson here. When people's lived experience stops matching the official story, the story loses its power. You can't fact check reality out of existence. And the truth is, the more and more people are starting to notice that disconnect for themselves. The narrative isn't collapsing because of politics, it's collapsing because people finally trust their own eyes more than someone else's explanation. So, if you made it this far, thank you for staying on board. This train doesn't stop at easy destinations, but every stop gets a little clearer, a little more honest. What I've learned through all of this is simple. When people stop trusting the media, the government, And even the so called experts, they start trusting what they can see for themselves. And that's where we are right now, a country that no longer believes the story, only the evidence of its own eyes. Maybe that's uncomfortable, but it's also where real change happens. So until the next stop, thanks for riding with me.